What I'm going to talk about this evening is something which I've never talked about before, the brand values of the chase. It's a bit weird, it's a bit unusual because we are a branding company and we've never looked at ourselves. We've got a strong personality, we do have values, we have a process, we have a philosophy, but we've never really put them together in a way in which we do for our clients. I thought that I would, to try and make it a bit more interesting, I would attach a story to each value to explain in how we work. It says a lot more than just the words. So these are our values. First one, inquisitive. I think every company like ours is inquisitive. You've got to find out a lot about your clients and stuff. And then obviously the second one is conceptual. So obviously we are known as an ideas-led company. 3 is relevance. We have to stay relevant to a brand. 4, collaborative. We like working with other creative people. And 5, tenacious. If I start with the first one, it's the word inquisitive, and the story I'll attach to that is called The Woodcarver. Now, maybe 1 or 2 people in here are familiar with that one, who know the chase. It's embedded in everything we do. But before I go into that, I'll just show you the sort of work that influenced us when we took off. I worked in London in the 70s, and it was considered to be the golden age of British advertising, and it was fantastic. So it was that time, and it was people were experimenting. It's a very creative world. It's as if someone had turned colour on after the sort of dullness of the post-war period. This is the work that was coming out of London. London was known to be the epicentre of the creative industries, and particularly in advertising. It was acknowledged throughout the world that the best work was being done in London. This is work done by an advertising agency called Collett Dickinson Pierce, and it followed from Donald J. Bernbach in New York, started this new approach to advertising, and London really got a grip of that and took it a stage further and made it a sort of Englishness. This is before global advertising, so it was really strong concepts, very well executed. The show and the rage now, the typography on the bottom, of course, but it was really well executed, and there's a touch of wit about it as well. And this could be done now, actually. This is for Whitehorse whiskey. A very simple idea, Scotch and American, double Scotch, neat Scotch, Scotch on the rocks and Scotch and ginger. Just simple ideas, but beautifully photographed. And of course it was happening in design as well at that time, with companies like Pentagram were taking off, Manoli Tattersfield. So it was that's where we wanted to be. This was the Sunday Times magazine, which started in the late 60s. And it really did change. I mean, now you need a wheelbarrow to carry all the magazines you get in a newspaper, but then it was quite unusual. It was a real breakthrough. And they were very experimental with layout, magazine layout, and also it opened the door for a lot of new illustrators and photographers and things. When you start out, your dilemma you've got, like any startup company, you've no work that you can call your own work. So you've got to think of some way around that. And while I was struggling with this sort of dilemma about how we promote ourselves, I was driving home one night and I had the local station on the car radio, and it was somebody being interviewed who'd been on a trip to India and he was recounting his sort of adventure. He ended up telling this story which really changed the chase, and it was about the wood carvers on the street. They're for tourists. They make these wooden elephants out of just blocks of wood, and when one of them was asked how he did it, he said, "I just cut away the wood that doesn't like an elephant," which was a fantastic response, really, and disarming response. And it really summed up what we felt about what we wanted to do. And that thought has run right through everything we do, right from the work we take on, the strategic work, when we look at what a company, an organisation is, and equally important what it isn't, right through to the end of the design process, which is when we're working to style a piece of work. And we have everything's just got a reason for being. Every mark on the paper has a reason for being when we do it. This is a recent business card which we've just produced. And I suppose now we laser away the wood that doesn't like an elephant. Harriet Devoy used to work for us in London. She used to put it well, she said, "We're communicators, not decorators." The next value is conceptual, and the title of the story is a news agent. When we started up in the 80s, and Malcolm will remember this, there was a big clash between companies that went into one camp or the other, and I couldn't get into that. There was one that was considered to be ideas-led, and the others were considered to be style-led. And I didn't like, because one of my favourite designers was Gert Den Baren, and I loved his work, and it was just a different way of going about it. where they had an idea, you could recognise their work a mile off, but they could adapt it to different situations. But it sort of attracted the right sort of work. That seemed a reasonable way of working, a good way of working, but it wasn't for us. We were more influenced, of course, by the work where it's sort of concept-led, and so it would take you wherever that takes you. That was our theory. When I'm asked why I think ideas are good, I sort of try and tell this story to explain it. And it's a true story. It was a relative of mine, apparently, went on holiday to Ireland, and while she was there, she went into a shop, and she asked them if they sold English papers, and the lady said, "Do you want today's or yesterday's?" Which confused my relative a bit. And she said, "Well, today's." And she said, "Well, you'll have to come back tomorrow." Now, I mean, but a lot of people might consider that to be a very poor piece of communication, because why did she just say it takes a day to get newspapers from England? But had she done that, I don't think I'd be recounting that story 30 years later. So that's why I say ideas can be good. They can work for your communication. And these are some examples of ideas which I've just put together quite quickly, just across a range of things. This is logotypes. Sometimes a lot is demanded of a logotype. If you're presenting that as part of a new identity, then it can be very difficult. Branding is made up of all sorts of things. The logotype can just be a signature. But this was for the Co-op Travel, and they had a company called Freedom, and they had this awful type and a terrible drawing of a seagull. What we did was take the type and just simply take the seagull out of it, and the word freedom. And I suppose it's cutting away the type that doesn't like a seagull effect. This is the more recent work we've done. This is for Blinkbox, an identity for them, and obviously they're involved in movies, and that's the symbol for movies. Music, that's the symbol for sound, and books, that's the symbol for books. Now, if we put those together, we can get a box out of that, and we can also get a bee out of that, and I'm sure with a bit of animation we'd probably get a blink out of that as well. So these things are there often, they're not always there, but it's the first place to look for ideas, perhaps. So an idea can come out of a logotype. I think it's a golfer that said that the more you practice, the luckier you get. So you've got to really work at these things. This was an old job. It's my favourite job we've ever done, but it's a classic conceptual job because there was no other way of doing it. If you'd been tried to put some design into it, it would have killed the idea. I think the Americans would call it serendipity. It just happened to work out that the 2p stamps was green and the 5p stamp was brown, and it all made up the price of the first class stamp. And the post office were great. They hand stamped them. They went out flat, and all we did put a score down the middle, so you got it and put it there. So that's purely concept. The timing is important in ideas. Some with posters, you've got to be immediate. With other media, you can maybe be a bit more subtle, perhaps. But these were two posters we did. One was the one on the left was for us, the chase, showing how clever and what lateral thinkers we are. On the right, it's quite old. That it was when dating agencies first started going online. It was called a love browser. This was a job for the Manchester Dogs Home, and it did a number of things. It was the annual report, and it was a brochure for them to raise money, all sorts of things. I think one thing's about ideas. If you can change people's minds about things, or at least give them a different way of looking at something, then it's doing a job. And what this is doing is we took dogs, because what they primarily do is collect dogs off the street and put them in a home and try and find a proper home for them. So we put dogs in the position that people could recognise that homeless people are in. So they would be begging these dogs on the streets, and they may get bullied by gangs. So we had images of all these things. So people maybe started to think a bit differently about when they saw stray dogs around. The third value is relevance, and the story is the psychiatrist. If we find out what a brand is and then what it isn't, and then we start working on it, we go off another direction, we've all been pointless. So what you do, you've got to keep on track, of course, and that means creatively. I think we're all tempted to, when we have a creative idea, and it's really clever, and it's not, we sense it's not just quite right, but we try and sneak it through. You fall in love with the idea, but even though it's not quite right. So it's difficult, but you've got to resist that temptation. Before I started the chase, I was teaching, and this was a friend of mine, who was a lecturer, was going through a rough time. Contrary to popular belief, teaching is incredibly stressful. You know, you're dealing with people's lives. So it was getting to this friend of mine who was a lecturer, and he was starting to have panic attacks. So he was advised to go and see a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, well, you know, we'll get you better. He reassured him. But he said, before you come back next time, just make a note of your dreams, and we'll start to help discuss and maybe find out what's at the bottom of your problem. And so he did that, and then he came back a week or so later. He was on, I don't know whether they're still on couches or whatever they're on, but he said, the psychiatrist said, what was your first dream about? And he said, Gaza. And he said, the psychiatrist stopped him straight away, and he said, wow, he said, that is a really strong insight. You're relating your problems, your conflict in your life, to the ones in the world, to the Gaza Strip. It was going on like this, and my friend had to interrupt him and say, well, Gaza's a footballer, actually. I dreamt about being a footballer. So you can go off in the wrong direction if you're not careful. The work that we did that was very interesting and way ahead of its time, and it took a bit of keeping on track, was the work we did for the Co-op Bank. And they had a very creative, very imaginative marketing department, and they asked us and their advertising agent to work together just to explain how they operated. But up to that point, they were a small bank, and they were saying, oh, we're a bank too. That was their argument. We've got all the things. So they were going nowhere. And then they decided to tell people how they worked. And they had all these principles that they wouldn't lend money to companies that worked in certain ways. So they run that past their customers. And then we got involved with launching it. But the reason they've got this in keeping in relevance, it was always a temptation to talk about not being a bank. The ethics was such a strong thing that you got pulled away, and you forget you're a bank. You know, you've got all the things that banks have. We did help them along the way to introduce them to, as part of the brand development, into like-minded organisations. It was called Creative Pen and Ink, and we briefed illustrators to come up with an idea which they wanted to make a stink about. That was the idea, and they used to use black and white. And then we had an exhibition in London, and they met each other, and they got the account. So it's getting them to be seen in the right places with the right people as a brand development. The fourth one is collaborative, and this is a story about called the Motorcyclist. I live in the Ribble Valley, which is largely a rural community. And when I first moved there, I was wandering, having a look around the area, and there was a farmer at the top of the lane. And he told me this funny story about when he'd moved in, which was about 30 years earlier. And he said at that time there was very little traffic on the roads out there. And he could hear a motorcyclist coming from the distance. And it went past him and disappeared further on. Then a few minutes later, it started coming back. And it stopped him. And he said, well, have you been there long, to the farmer? And he said, yeah. He said, did you notice me going past before? And he said, yeah. He said, was there a woman on the back? And he said, well, no. And he went off, and then a few minutes later, come back with a woman on the back. So I don't know about that. But you've got, the best way to do is you can't work alone. That's the point of that story. You've got to work with other people. And so these are some examples. This is so complex, I won't go into it, but I'll just briefly explain. 48-sheet posters, 2 12-month calendars. Another client that we introduced to the bank was Big Issue. The collaborative nature of this is that all these illustrators were working together without knowing. We gave them a brief, and within the brief we gave them a shape, and then they had to come up with an illustration of what was the big issue for them. But there was the shape, part of it had to be light and part of it had to be dark. And when it all came together, it spelt out the big issue, which was like a big point of sale for the vendors to sell the calendars from. This is almost extinct, and this is the sort of collaborating with not just the creative partners, but also the people you're aiming at, getting those involved. And we sent out a bullet marker, red bullet marker, so people could cross off. Those are photographs of all the endangered species, so 365, which we got little cutouts of. And so they would cross out each one. So every day they'd be reminded about just how many animals are in danger of becoming extinct. This was for D&AD. and Unit Packard, who they would start with, they were sponsored by them. This is for a sandwich placement scheme which they were launching. We photographed them with just a subtle change. They're just pressing against the glass. The simple idea, they're always on the outside looking in. So this was an idea, the placement would give them the opportunity to get on the inside. And then it applied across a number of media. It worked particularly well on the website, where it was glass, what they were looking out from. This was, we work with copywriters, although these are posters for a photographer. And we thought, well, rather than, we were asked if we'd do him a mailer, and we said, well, rather send a picture out and they see one picture. Let's try and get people on your website where they can see your full portfolio. So we got copywriters to write exactly 1,000 words about a picture of their choice in his portfolio, and ask whoever was receiving it to check on the website, so you'd have a picture in your mind about what it was be by the copywriter's interpretation. And then you would go on the website and it would actually dissolve into the actual image. You can see how far that. And then when you're on your website, you'd probably look around for other work. The final one is Tenacious, which is it's probably more to do with the business side of it than the creative side. But we've been through several recessions, and the speed that work goes through, you need enormous amounts of tenacity to get through that. You've got to be so determined. I was brought up in a Catholic near a football ground. The two things did have an impact on my life, and the reason why is that when I grew up, I was really excited on being in an area like that, because the crowds would come, and particularly on night matches when they'd always be in sort of high spirits, and they'd go to this strange building that lit up and roared and groaned and all that. And as soon as I was old enough, I went to watch my team, Preston North End. And this was, the story's called League Table. This was highlighted his Preston's position. Now that was the first division then. It was equivalent to the Premier League. They finished runners-up in the first division. When I started the chase, that's what had happened. That was a period that I'd supported them. And this is where the Catholic comes in. Being a Catholic, I felt I inherited the guilt, and I thought it's got to be something to do with me. and to put this beyond reasonable doubt, I spent a year at Blackpool at college, and during that year, in the set, they were both Blackpool and Preston had a fierce rivalry. Blackpool got promoted to the first division, the ones at the top, and Preston got relegated. And that was a year at Blackpool. And not only that, the final game of the season was at Preston, so all the Blackpool supporters were celebrating, and we were going down. And it really sickened me. I thought, it was a horrible feeling. I get a sick feeling now when I think about it. It's the worst thing you can imagine. And I thought, well, I'm going to have to, when they get the opportunity, I'm going to try and do something about this. So when the chase started in 1986, about 4 or 5 years later, we were working on Manchester's Olympic bid. I don't know if you can remember that. And we were doing some work on the stadium to send out to potential architects should they be successful. So we're doing a lot of research into football grounds, and all the good ones then were in Italy. It was just following on from Italia 90, and compared with the English grounds, which were awful, these were really nice. And not just that, there was a Taylor report. You'd have to Hillsborough, so the teams would have to change. So I designed a football ground, and I went to see on the site. I knew the site because I had to live around there. And it happened. It would take 5 days to explain the story in full, but it took an enormous amount of tenacity, I can tell you. So this was the football ground I designed. It was obviously working with a team. I'm not an architect, but there was engineers to work with, and also some technical architects to help. But I had the last say in the aesthetics of it. I had the good bits, the nice bits, and the sort of master plan of it. And we collaborated with other companies. There's the interior with a company in Manchester, OMI. We worked with that. On the seating, the football clubs just follow each other, and they tend to have initials made out of the seating. But as the stands were named after famous players, I thought if we use these seats as pixels, like it is on the right, then we could make an image of a face, and it worked very well. And also at the time when it's happening, a young sculptor came to see me, and he was a Preston supporter, and said, could he help in some way? And I said, well, can you do bronze statues? Because we had this idea. The Preston's most famous player was called Tom Finney, and the top right photograph is it's called the Splash. And I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic if something is captured on film, a three-dimensional thing is captured on film, and then we make it in 3 dimensions as a sculpture and make it a fountain, so we recreate the Splash. We did a football museum inside, working with a company called Land in London. And this is a film we did. That was a time when Nike were doing a series of commercials which were showing their skills, and it was a send-up of that. We had to get Nike's permission to do it, but they were very helpful in that area. And an art director, a director called Mark Denton worked on that. So we're still talking about tenacity, and we're talking about league tables, and this is the final slide. And when we started, we wanted to be the best. Now there's lots of different ways of measuring that. And you can never claim to be really the best, but it's a reasonable measure. Was a league table done by Design Week magazine, which picked on all the competitions in Britain and America mainly, and then did they sort of gave a hierarchy of marks to them, and it was based over a 3-year period. And for about 12 years we were in the top 6, but we never quite made it to number 1. It was really irritating. We finished second about twice. Once, I think Pentagram beat us by 2 marks once. It was really annoying. And then last year we got to number 1. So that took an enormous amount of tenacity. I can't tell how much that took. But thanks very much. That's it.